And the emotion is the real reason that readers read books. I mean, across the board, we have to understand that from a high level. They could do anything they wanted to be entertained or to gain new information or to pass the time. But the reason that they specifically choose fiction is because fiction is a safe space for readers to feel big emotions and to help process their emotion, from a psychological standpoint. And the world we live in just doesn't hold space for big emotions.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Liesel Hill about using relevance to save your darlings, including the importance of integrating emotional connection and subconscious storytelling to retain seemingly irrelevant scenes by making them essential. Topics include multitasking in scenes, pacing, evoking emotion, character arcs, purposeful character deaths, maintaining continuity in series, and avoiding unnecessary plot elements. And now let's hear from Liesel Hill about using relevance to save your darlings. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Liesel Hill. Hey, Liesel, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Liesel Hill is a USA Today bestselling author of 4 genres. She teaches authors to craft stories using the principles of energetics and transformational human psychology and by tapping into one's individual subconscious creativity. And I invited Liesel back to the podcast because I had read a blog post she had written and also did a episode on this for her podcast about killing your darlings. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means, but that's like the battle cry for so many writers. You have to be willing to kill your darlings. But we're going to be taking like a slightly different take on that, which I think will be very fun. So why don't we start out? Can you just describe for people who maybe are not familiar with the term, what does the phrase kill your darlings come from?
Sure. So I think it was popularized by Stephen King, but basically it means that sometimes when you are trying to figure out your story, especially if you're pantsing it, especially if you're on, maybe the first book that you've ever written and you're not doing much planning and, you're kind of a newbie at it, sometimes you're going to write a scene that you really love and that you, the author, connect to a lot when you're writing it. And kill your darlings means that if you realize that it's really not serving your story, then you may have to delete that, edit it out, and you may not be able to use it. So it's killing your darlings as in killing kind of your favorite scene.
And can you give some examples where that's completely legitimate advice? Like, are there common situations that are always a red flag that this is one of those darlings that a writer has to get rid of?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that there's like a specific topic or type of scene or anything, but it's mostly a matter of, I think a lot of writers write scenes in order for them, the author, to get to know their character. And the scene doesn't have a lot that's relevant to the story. So anytime that's not tied in to the core conflict, and it has nothing to do with where the story is going, the reader doesn't need to know what's in that scene in order to understand the ending of the story, that sort of thing, that's usually a pretty big red flag that it's fluff and that it's probably going to need to be cut.
So I know that one of your positions is that the real defining thing is the relevance of the particular item to the story. Mm-hmm. And you had argued that there are some times when, a surface look might encourage an editor or a beta reader or a fellow author in a critique group or something like that to say, oh yeah, that's something you've got to get rid of. That's a darling you've got to kill. But you kind of advise that people not just take that advice to heart immediately. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a few different things that I teach. One of them is to write your story from your subconscious mind, which can be hours and hours of blog posts or in podcast episodes on it in itself. But when you're doing that, when you're pulling from your subconscious mind, it means that you, the author, are automatically going to be emotionally connected to it. And I actually think that's really, really important. If there's something that is lighting you up about the story that you really love about it, there's no reason that the reader would not feel the same way. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that I already said is untrue. You still need to make sure that it's relevant to the story. You still need to make sure that you're tying it in somehow. But my position is just that rather than killing them off willy-nilly and just leaving it at that, there are ways that you can take your favorite scenes and make them relevant to the story. You can tie them in and do it in a way that's very efficient and that, it's really not what it sounds like. It sounds like I'm talking about shoehorning it in and just making it work, white knuckling it. That's not what I mean at all. You really can tie it in to the intrinsic plot and internal arc. And if you do that, and if you can make it relevant, and if the emotion is there, I think that there is a lot of a lot of value in trying to make those things work. Again, because if there's a particular scene, for example, this happens a lot. So an author will come up with a scene that's late in the book, 3/4 of the way through the book, maybe even at the climactic moment. And that's how they actually come up with their story. And so the entire time they're writing toward that scene. And then when they get to that scene, it kind of doesn't work anymore because the story has just taken them to different places. And that's common. But I'm one who believes that you can still make the scene work. You may have to tweak it. You may have to do some things to it to make sure that it still does work for the book. But I'm a big believer in really getting to know all parts of story, getting to know the nature of story, becoming a true master storyteller. Because once you do, you can make any story work the way that you want it to. You just have to know the ingredients to get it to work, basically. And the problem is that most authors don't know what those are. They're not just the surface things like character and setting and plot. It's a lot deeper than that, but it can be learned.
Yeah, I've had that experience where a scene that was sort of the trigger for a book, it never made it to the last,
right,
to the last version because I worked and eventually I just had to say, yeah, there's no plausible reason that character would do that. And the story had kind of taken me into a different direction. And I think that's especially hard when it's been the triggering scene that inspired the book. Like, I think people just assume, well, if that was like my impetus for writing this book, then it has to get in there and I'm going to find a way to get it in there any way I can. It's a little easier if it's just something that has come up in the process of you committing the story to paper and maybe you're not quite so emotionally invested in it. I think that's the difficult thing, like getting the distance to understand, to make that relevance assessment.
Yeah. I can go a few different ways with that. I mean, for one thing, I think that, first of all, it's important to understand that if you don't get the scene in because you decide it's not serving your story, that's okay. We can definitely do that. On the other hand, if you really feel like it needs to be in there, that's okay too. So it's not any hard and fast rule. We have to do what works for our story. But the one thing, first of all, I would say that there are ways to make sure, which is the easiest thing to do, on the front end, that you're always writing toward that scene so that you don't accidentally write away from it and then it doesn't work. But that's kind of a whole other process and a whole other thing to talk about. In terms of the emotion, one of the biggest things that I teach is to write emotional stories. Because what people don't understand is that pretty much everything we talk about in story, when it comes to hooking a reader, boils down to emotion. So we talk about things like making sure we have 3-dimensional characters and dynamic characters. We talk about good world building that's really engaging. We talk about having scenes that turn and showing instead of telling and getting rid of passive voice. But all of these things can be boiled down to the fact that it's interrupting the emotion. And the emotion is the real reason that readers read books. I mean, across the board, we have to understand that from a high level. They could do anything they wanted to be entertained or to gain new information or to pass the time. But the reason that they specifically choose fiction is because fiction is a safe space for readers to feel big emotions and to help process their emotion, from a psychological standpoint. And the world we live in just doesn't hold space for big emotions, So it's I really love talking about how our stories that we write can actually help our readers be more emotionally mature. Now, with all of that being said, when an author is really emotionally connected to something like one of their darlings, one of their scenes, I actually don't like the idea of cutting that. Of course, relevancy to the story, all of that is important. We cannot ignore that. But because the author is so connected to it, if they are really lit up about it and really excited about it, I want them to be able to convey that same excitement to their reader. And that way they are connecting with their reader through that scene on an emotional level. And so to just cut it off and say, oh, well, it doesn't really work anymore. I mean, on some level, I kind of consider that a tragedy. And it does have to be done sometimes. It's not like across the board, it's going to work every single time. But there are ways to make sure that you can make the scene work. And it really I think a lot of it depends on how much work you want to do. Obviously, most people don't want to go back and rewrite their entire book once they realize it's not working. But could you, like you said, it depends on how big a thing is it. Could you go back and sprinkle in other scenes or insert an earlier scene that would explain why the choice is made in that scene? Or, you know what I mean? There's different ways to do it. And it's just a matter of whether it's worth it to you to put the extra work in, or not.
Well, I do find that for my own writing, some of those scenes that, I'll do a pass and then I'll get back to that scene and I'll think, I love that scene because it illustrates, like my favorite thing is showing two characters, like matching up all the characters in different configurations. Like I have kind of a semi-cast past sort of thriller series. And the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers, Lizzy is the main character, but she's surrounded by a bunch of allies that are also very important. And my goal is by the end of the series to have had every character have some interaction with another. And so I'll think, here's an opportunity for me to have these two characters who haven't really interacted significantly before. And what I find helps with that relevance is if it can do double duty. And so having the characters have an interaction that illustrates their relationship is fun. But if you can also use it to advance the story or plant a red herring or do something else too, I think that idea of having a character or a scene or whatever it is doing double duty gets toward that goal of making it all relevant and making it all hang together.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that. I think that part of the problem with, when this happens, when people write scenes that end up not being very relevant, is because, like I said, it happens mostly with newer writers who aren't experienced enough to incorporate more than one aspect of the story into a single scene. So they've written a scene that stands on its own that's just this and doesn't contribute to the story in another way. Like you're saying, if you can make it relevant and make it do double duty, I'm actually putting together a series for my podcast on pacing. And that's a big part of it. I mean, people say, well, how do I fix pacing? My story seems like it's bogged down and it's going too slow. Chances are you're trying to do one thing at a time then. You need to really kind of multitask and make every single scene and every single paragraph do multiple things. And that's hard. It's a juggling act. That's the skill of learning to be a fiction writer, So it takes time and it takes practice, but I think we kill off fewer of our darlings as we get more writing experience because we just know how to incorporate things, just naturally as we're going into the story. And again, we still kill them off sometimes, if it ends up not serving, but you're just going to see less and less of that as you become a more seasoned writer.
Yeah. One of the things that your comment about the writing from the subconscious mind reminded me of that I think serves this something doing double duty is that I'll often keep sort of a running list of all the biggish issues I'm dealing with. Like, it doesn't kind of make sense that this character waits an hour before he does something, or it kind of doesn't make sense that these two characters talked and this topic never came up, whatever those things are
Right.
that I know I'm going to have to address. And oftentimes I find that when I come up with an answer to one, it almost always solves more than one problem. Okay. So I think, it makes sense that he waits an hour to do this because of such and such. And because of that, now I have an answer to why this topic didn't come up in the conversation with the other character. And I've got to believe that's just my subconscious mind, like noodling on that. There's this whole stew of things I have to fix. And the mind kind of goes, we'll fix this one and this one and this one with this one thing. And we'll fix this one and this one with this one thing. And I think that's one of the most fun. That's the most fun I have when I'm writing, when I come up with one of those. And I'm like, kill two birds with one stone.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. That is your subconscious mind, because your subconscious mind will come up with things that you cannot come up with consciously because you either can't connect the dots quite on that level, or, you know what I mean? Subconscious pulls from everything you've ever read, everything you've ever written. It pulls from everything in your memory that you can't consciously call up. So yeah, I always teach my students to, you have to ask it questions. Your subconscious and your intuition is only as good as the questions that you ask it. So, but if you say, I've got this problem, this problem, this problem, like you may not even realize that's what you're doing, but you're asking your subconscious, okay, let's figure this out. So when an answer comes to mind, it's actually answering more than one. It's answering all of them, or, however many. So yeah, that's super cool. That's a good way to put it. And I like that, the idea of using your subconscious to solve all of your story problems at one time.
Yeah.
Than trying to figure out little things for each chapter and then go, oh, wait, does that still work? Is that still continuous?
Yeah, I do realize that text of elements serving more than one purpose I never thought about it this way, but it's sort of foundational to how I write fiction, because a lot of times, I'll write a story with, 3 henchmen. And then I'm guaranteed that in a later pass, that's either going to become 2 henchmen or 1 henchman, because I see an opportunity. Like, there's really not a reason to have 3 henchmen. And my stories are generally more sort of like a very insulated kind of claustrophobic world. And so that works well. Like, I don't want an army of henchmen. I want like one really evil or one really a golden-hearted henchman or whatever it might be. And I think that, if you've got the scene that's only serving one purpose, as you were saying before, if you have the character that's only serving one purpose, it is very just kind of going from like dot to dot to dot to dot. It feels boring. But if you're sort of running around in the maze, like if you're the if you're the reader and you're running around in the maze and then you pop out into the middle of the maze where the payoff is and you think, oh, it was all worth the running around and I see what the author was doing. That's kind of the holy grail of, I think, especially mystery, thriller, and suspense writers.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why I'm such a fan of understanding your story at a high level. I always say I'm not much of a pantser. First of all, we need to put to bed this plotting versus pantsing whole argument, because everybody does both, at least a little bit of both. We're just either usually more plotter or more pantser. But anyway, I'm much more of a plotter, and I completely understand that some people just need to pants parts of their story because that's how their process works. But once you know what your story is, I'm a big fan of seeing it at a high level, almost like the difference between like being on a hiking trail and looking down at the hiking trail from a bird's eye view and being able to see the whole thing. It really helps to be able to figure out all of your variables, everything that needs to come together. If you know that this subplot character needs to do this at the end, you can put in, clues to that or the first little breadcrumbs of that early on. You know what I mean? So it's something that can be done in layers. Certainly, I think most stories are written in layers and passes, even though like our job is to make it seem like we just sat down and typed out the entire thing from beginning to end. And it's just so cohesive and beautiful, but that's not generally how we write them. But yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. We have a lot of balls in the air that we need to juggle. And I think one of the skills is not only being able to tell each individual part in a way that evokes emotion in the reader, but also being able to bring them all together cohesively. So for example, I'm actually writing right now, it's a dragon fantasy. It's very high, medieval, high fantasy kind of thing that has 6 point of view characters, kind of think Game of Thrones, only it's more family friendly than that. And you could argue that I'm almost writing 6 books in one because each of these point of view characters has their own internal arc and their own story going on. It just happens to be in the same world. But I always have to make sure I don't want it to be 6 different books in every single installment. I want it to be all the same story. So I have to bring them together. I have to show how they are influencing each other, even when they're not in the same space. I have to show how the magic, a lot of times something will happen in one place and then the others will observe it and be like, oh, what's going on? You know what I mean? So things like that. I think it's just a good illustration for how we have to keep everything in mind. And yeah, it does feel like we got the brain cramp and we're going crazy a little bit sometimes because we have so many things to keep track of. But if you can really pull it all together and make it all work in a way that the reader just goes, oh, that was beautiful, then you've done your job as a writer. And that, like I said, that's just the skill of a master storyteller. And it does take time and experience to master. So that's kind of, I think I agree. I liked what you said about it, kind of the holy grail. That's what we're all after.
Yeah, I'm working on what will be sort of the last book of my Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. And I think this would kill me if this wasn't my 12th book, because now I've had the experience of thrashing through 11 other ones. Because what I want to make sure is that not only do all the storylines get wrapped up the way I want them to get wrapped up for all, this cast of characters, kind of like what you're saying, but also they need to get wrapped up in a way that's ultimately representative of that character and then where they're going to be going after that story. So, if I were working on book 5, I'd be like, oh, I'll have book 6 where I can achieve whatever else I want to do with the overarching arc of the story. But in this one, I'm like, no, like every character, the way they contribute to the ending, the reader has to say, of course, that's how they would contribute to the end of the story. So, I think this idea of just having done it the hard way before, like getting through a whole story and realizing, well, that didn't quite work out and having to really rip and tear, has paved the way for this not being, at least so far, knock on wood, as hellish an experience as it might have been if I didn't have that experience under my belt.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's true of most writers. I mean, our first books tend to be a little bit all over the place, but we learn really quickly from our mistakes. And the other thing I would say is that it is not so much once a book, well, I guess you could say it. One thing that you can do, I actually have a series that I have not finished that I kind of started that way. And I feel like I've done a book in the series at each level of skill that I have. So as you go on, it definitely, I think there's a changing feel to the story. And I want to finish it. I'm hoping to finish it this year, like write the last 2 books of it. But one thing that I do, if anyone finds themselves in that space, like when you started out and now you're over here and you're not sure exactly how to make it feel as cohesive, it actually works really well to go back through your previous books, even if they're already published, and pick out things that you can pull into later novels. So it's almost like mining the earlier books for details. And then if you can call back to those earlier books or even use them in the plot of later books or, however they fit, however you craft it, you're kind of tricking the reader into thinking, oh, I totally did that on purpose in the first book so that I could write it over here. And then it feels like, even though you didn't actually come up with it until like 2 years later. So that's one thing that people can do because I think there's a lot of authors who find themselves in a similar situation to that. They start in one place and they aren't as skilled, and then they become more skilled and they go, oh man, what do I do with the series now? But there are ways to fix it and to shore it up.
Yeah, I have one like that where one of the characters, he has to like quickly leave home, and his landlord packs up a box of things for him and he leaves with it. And that was like 3 books ago, and the box hasn't been opened yet. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to have to open the box in book 6 and I don't even know what's in it. It better be something good.
Yep. The longer you go without opening it, the better it has to be.
Yeah. Also, if you're indie published, you can just go back and like change that. And then box slipped off the bridge and into the water and you never saw it again. But readers do, like, I think returning to that whole idea of making things doubly, like having them serve more than one purpose, when something like that happens, then that's very disappointing to a reader because they'll say, yeah, there's really no reason that box slipped into the river other than because the author didn't know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's really important to understand, I agree. I think our readers are really smart. And this is why we don't just say that everything needs to be relevant or pertain to the story just because that's how it is. You know what I mean? I mean, obviously that's going to make a more cohesive story, but our readers are conditioned to think that every single thing you put in there, like Chekhov's gun sort of concept, is going to mean something. So if you're putting something in, you really probably should have a plan for it. Or you'll hear from your readers not in a good way in the reviews.
Yeah, I don't even remember what the object was anymore, but an unusual object. It must have been, as I recall, it was something that I was writing it based on a real place, and this real place had whatever this unusual object was in it. I thought, oh, that would be cool to include. And I was like, I really can't because it's so unusual that someone's going to get to the end and say, whatever happened to that, pastry maker that you mentioned that was in the kitchen, whatever it is. I recognize that this is a little different than killing off your darlings, but I thought of it as we were talking, and that is the idea of killing off characters. There are all these memes of like the evil writer cackling and rubbing their hands as they kill off characters and cause great consternation among their readers. Is there any analogy between these things that we're talking about in terms of killing your darlings in the sense of like scenes or things like that, and the idea of killing off characters, which I find increasingly hard to do as I go through a series, the more I like my characters, the more unwilling I am to kill them off.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we could draw some lines. I think, obviously, if you're going to keep a character around, you need to have a plan for them. So they shouldn't just be there to be there. But I don't know. I can kind of see it both ways in some ways. I mean, the official, storyteller response is to make sure that they still have a role in the story. Otherwise, you should probably get rid of them. And there's also something to be said for telling a character arc, like an internal character arc, and having it come to the natural close and then getting rid of them. So that's kind of like the official thing to say. As long as you still have a purpose for them in the story, yeah, keep them around. But on the flip side, there is also something to be said for readers who love that character, for just doing something for your readers to show that that character was happy and just walked off into the sunset or something like that. I don't think that's a negative thing either. So it's kind of a balancing act. What I would not do, I would not kill characters off for shock value. There needs to be a purpose in why you kill them off as well. And that can get pretty deep into story structure and the type of ending you're going for and what exactly you're trying to say. I mean, you have things like tragedies and horror stories and cautionary tales that tend to end badly for the character anyway. But those are, you're trying to get a specific message across, but just to kill somebody off, I don't think that's ever a good tactic. And honestly, it's kind of betraying your readers to do that. So you just really, I think you, number one, need to have a really good reason to kill them off. And, like I say, you need to close their character arc, make it feel like, okay, well, at least this and this happened before this person died, But you also just need to make sure that you're setting it up and leaving breadcrumbs so that you're not completely blindsiding your readers with it either, because they're not going to like that either. So I think there's just a lot of intentionality that needs to be put into it. And also know that when you kill off a beloved character, you are going to get some backlash. There's always going to be some people who complain no matter how good you are about it. But like I said, what comes to mind is Harry Potter. I remember J.K. Rowling saying that she was actually in book 4 going to kill off the Weasley father when he was injured and bitten by the snake. And when she got there, she just couldn't do it. She loved him too much. And so she made him live. And I was going, well, I do understand that. I mean, he's not a main character. There's not a whole lot of role he has in the story, but maybe it doesn't matter because he's not getting a lot of screen time anyway. So just be nice to your readers every once in a while and let the character live,
Yeah, there's a character I have that I always think, oh, this is the one where he's gonna die because he's the character who's most like his actions would be most likely to lead to some tragic ending for him. And I've never been able to do that. And I'm realizing based on what you said that there's literally killing off the character and then there's like moving the character to the side because they're not, their work is done or they're no longer serving a purpose or whatever. But I think even then it's important to apply that relevance and that intentionality in the sense that you don't want them to just suddenly be, have disappeared. But if they're part of the crime gang and now they've left to become a legitimate accountant, then there should be something there that sets up, they yearned their whole life to get out from the evil of the mafia, and now they're living the life they wanted because they're living an upstanding life, or they're being punished because now they don't have the riches that came to them as a member of the mafia, whatever those things are. But that it shouldn't just be them kind of fading away. Like
Right.
Even if you're getting rid of them because they didn't pan out quite the way you wanted them to in a series, there should still be some kind of explanation for what happened to them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're right about relevance too. I've got a character that I've always planned on killing them off at the end of book 2, but I really like the character. It's like this snarky older woman. And so I'm trying to figure out, I'll probably still do the killing her off thing, but it's a magical place. So I might be able to bring her back, but I have to find some way or tie her in some way that's going to work to bring her back. And I haven't figured out exactly what that is yet. So what I will say is that if I can't figure it out, I probably won't bring her back, even though I really love her and I want to bring her back, but I'm hoping I can find some way to tie her in again later. So
yeah,
relevance is still important.
Yeah. If you're writing in a magical world or the world of Sherlock Holmes, then there's always a way to bring a character back if you decide you've made the wrong choice. Liesel, any other thoughts pertaining to the things you keep in a story and the things you don't keep in a story that you wanted to share regarding the whole idea of writing from the subconscious mind?
Do you get questions a lot about what to show versus what to tell? And it's when I get asked this, they're not talking about sentence level stuff. They're talking about what should we show in real time, as in write a whole scene around it versus like just telling this is what happened kind of in the past tense. And with that, I think, that's maybe another way to not kill off your darlings if you just want to tell it in a more general way because you don't want to go into the entire scene, which could be fluff. So there's that. But I think it's just a matter of, again, knowing how important any given event is. If it's a really important event that's going to change things for the character, that's going to change things for the story down the line, that's going to have a big impact on the plot and the direction the character is going, then you probably need to show it in real time. So if we use an example, if we say like a woman is going to the market and what happens at the market is going to be important. Maybe she sees a robbery or something, and that's going to be kind of one of the big events of the story. So that needs to be told in real time. But do we need to see in real time every step of her journey to the market, getting into the car, driving, stopping at the stoplight? No, because those things aren't going to be relevant to the story. So just kind of, I would say always put your scenes, your potential scenes through that filter. How important is it? And another thing you can ask, is it going to make the character feel something in a big way? She's not going to really feel something about a trip to the grocery store she takes several times a week, but seeing someone get robbed in a grocery store, that's a whole different thing. She's going to have all kinds of emotions about that. So I always just say it always comes down to emotion. Our job is to make our readers feel emotion, to kind of guide them through the story, through emotion, guide them to the cathartic point and give them that catharsis. If you can do that effectively, if you can help them feel emotions through every part of the story and then release them in the cathartic or climactic point, then you will never hurt for fans and readers because that's why they're here. So
perfect. Well, what a lovely wrap up to our conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. It's always fun to hear the counterpoint to what have become the old chestnuts of writing, like Kill Your Darlings. It's always fun to hear the counterpoint to those. So thank you so much for that. And please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was fun. Yeah, so my podcast is called Fiction Author Business School. That's probably the easiest place to find me. I do have a mini course, which is called 10 Universal Plot Points for Any Story, which is free. And I will send the link to Matty so she could put it in the show notes if anybody is interested in that. But I use something called transformational human psychology to put emotion in the story. And this is kind of like the first step of that. So if anybody's interested in that. But if you just want to find me, then the podcast is probably the best place.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Liesel. What are your thoughts on the idea of killing your darlings in writing? Have you ever had to cut a scene or a character you loved because it just didn't fit the story? I would love to hear about it. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindieauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.